welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name is Cassidy, I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. Today I've got a conversation for you with my friend Michael. I originally met Michael at a meetup group in Tucson, but have since continued a friendship with him through Discord, and we actually were able to hang out in person a couple times as well. And he's just a really interesting guy. He wanted to talk about identity and how the way identity has changed in modern narratives. And I thought the conversation was very fascinating. So I hope you think so too. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome. Good to see you, Cassidy.
It's so good to see you. It's been a little while.
Yeah. So you're out in the Netherlands right now, I'm thinking?
Yes, officially out here. I got my visa in December, so no more traveling back and forth.
Wow, that's excellent.
Yeah.
You still have to do like a 6-month kind of catch up or something like that? Or is it more full, like years at a time, or you have to go?
I've got 5 years, and then I can renew it.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah. Before I moved all my stuff here, but it was 3 months here, 3 months back in the U.S., then 3 months back here, and then back in the U.S. to get married. So it was wild. But yeah, now I've officially got my visa, so I can work and I can live. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can do all those things.
That's great. That's amazing. My sister lives out in Paris, and so she had a similar series of steps that she had to go through.
You went to visit her sometime last year, didn't you?
Yeah, she came here.
Oh, she came there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was turning 40 and I was getting ordained as a pastor in our quirky little church. And so my whole immediate family came out for my 40th birthday and the ordination installation of me as a pastor. So it was really cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I guess before we get too far, why don't you give a little background of yourself? Who are you for people who don't know you? And just whatever you feel like is important.
Yeah, my name is Michael Kuzno. I live in Tucson, Arizona. I have studied academic philosophy for probably a total of something like 7 years. I worked as an academic tutor for a really long time, but I've been part of this really small, very close-knit church community here in Tucson since 2005, although I had a pause for about 5 years when I was living in Colorado going to graduate school. And then I've been here since 2012. And recently the church wanted to promote me, I guess. It's weird to say it that way. But one of our founding pastors was retiring from full-time pastoring, or part-time pastoring anyway. So they were going to be missing a third pastor, and the way that our church works, they thought, well, we really do need a third pastor. And so they asked me to do that. And it wasn't something that I was seeking out. I didn't know that. I had not been preparing myself to become a pastor at any point in my life. I've never gone to seminary, but I'm figuring it out since September of last year.
Was it a hard decision to make, to be like, take that on, or did it feel like the natural step?
It wasn't a hard decision for me. It was whether I wanted to be sure that the church really wanted me to do that. Because as long as they think that I should be the pastor, then I agree with them.
Yeah. Well, and you've got a very unconventional church, as you mentioned, comparatively to a lot of it. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the church has existed since 2001. I wasn't there for the founding of it, but I actually live right across the street from one of the founding pastors who founded it out of a college ministry group that was operated by a pretty standard evangelical Baptist church. I mean, that's not the denominational name, but it's a Baptist church, and they were evangelical. And he was running a college ministry that met a lot of times in his house. And he was living together with 2 other couples. So there was 3 couples in this big house. It's down to now only 2 of those families. The third one didn't end up working out pretty early on, but and as things developed, the church was like, well, you guys aren't really our college ministry. You're more like your own church. So how about you go do that? And it wasn't really quite of a choice of theirs. that just happened. So
It was thrust upon them.
yeah, they were told that's what was happening. And so they started their own church in a way and made it more official over time, and were joined by other people who, one of the other founding pastors was trying to start Christian Reform, or this is typically referred to by the acronym CRC type churches, in Tucson. And he was having a really tough time actually making that happen. A lot of things were tried and failed. And he met up with the other guy who was in this kind of hippie house with the college ministry that was had turned into a church. And they met up and they joined together with their vision about what they wanted church to be. And out of that is the church that now exists. And it used to meet in a lot of ways in and around the University of Arizona campus here in Tucson, where I was an undergraduate student coming in 2005. And I found them meeting in the building of another church. And I just loved everything about it. Well, maybe not literally everything, but I loved a lot of really important things. Like the fact that there were two pastors for a tiny little church. That was really cool. You got a lot of instant and accessible engagement with the pastors.
Right.
And it wasn't that one pastor was like the head dominant pastor. So I found that really cool that they were both so, in a way, confident and at the same time humble in what they were saying and what they were doing, that they didn't mind that another pastor also was working in the same group of people.
Right.
Or preaching kind of back and forth between the two of them. And they oftentimes had a period specifically for response right after the sermon as part of the service, which we still continue. Not quite the same way as it used to be, but still today, there's a time to respond after the sermon is given. And in those days, it tended to be a more of an invitation to actually say things that were extremely critical of the message. We've turned it to be not quite as automatically thinking critical, but so now we say, does anyone have a response, rather than does anyone have criticism, which was oftentimes the way it was prompted during that time. But all of that was just extremely attractive to me. And there was always a meal right after. And the other thing was that it met at night, and I am not a morning person. So the fact that it met at 5:00 p.m. was really cool for me. It meant I didn't have to, wake up super early to start my Sunday. So there was and so the meal right after was a great place for me to get to know everybody.
Right.
I actually got to engage in these long, what seemed to me really deep and meaningful conversations. It turned out, they meant more and seemed deeper to me than maybe to other people who had been around for like 4 years. So it's funny, like one of the first appearances that I make in the church kind of, documentation, like on the website or like in recorded sermons, was like I invited everybody to my birthday in September. So I had arrived in August, and by September I was like, these are the people. These are like my best friends, right? Because I felt like I'd had these really deep and meaningful, and they were, because I wouldn't have thought so if they weren't. But on the other side of things, they were like, the pastor who I live, it's like one of my deepest, longest friendships now at this point in my life, who I live right across the street from. He took my picture on his dinky like camera phone, like super pixelated, not like blurry and all this kind of stuff. It's a far cry from like an iPhone 14 nowadays. And he said, do you know this man? He wants you to come to his birthday party, like, because he didn't really know who I was, and he thought it was weird that I was inviting the whole church to my birthday party. But what was crazy is it felt like maybe the whole church came to my birthday party in response to that invitation. And I think that was the thing. And then I was just part of the church. I've been a part of the church ever since, because they really welcomed me in and integrated me into what they were doing in their worship of God, and how they understood themselves, culture, Jesus. And yeah, I've been a part of it ever since.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's all these churches trying to create community groups or ways for you to get involved. And I mean, especially in Arizona, there's a lot of the mega churches and the big churches where it becomes very systematic of how, you sign up and then you get put in a group and this is how you get your little circles. But it's so interesting to look at something so simple like offering a meal after the service that creates that connection. And I experience that with Orthodoxy where we have the coffee hour after. So it's not a full meal, but you get coffee and bread. And those conversations are so meaningful in a way that, I just never had in Protestant churches, even though I was super connected and super deeply involved. There is something about just breaking bread with someone and taking that simple step of like opening it up to have a meal after the service. I don't know. It's powerful. So it's interesting because I don't think you see that at a lot of sort of the Protestant denominational churches, especially not the shared pastor. That's a very interesting model that you don't see very often.
Right, and now we have 3. So so we had 2 for about 50 at the time, I think. I mean, just kind of rough. I could probably talk to somebody who knows more of the hard numbers, but that's kind of just my rough recollection of it at the time. So there was about 50 people that are part of the church, and there were 2 pastors, which is crazy in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And now we have 3. We actually have 4 pastors, 3 elders. So I'm one of the elders, who are also pastors. So we actually have 4 pastors. That's even more accurate. And we're about like 150 people. And a ton of those are kids, which was not the case back in 2005. A lot of us were like college students, which to the older people were kids. But I mean, now we literally have like, under the age of 8, under the age of 12, like we just got like, feels like 40 to 70 kids. Yeah. Some days it feels like 70. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
all the college students
sometimes
got married and had babies. And
that's what happened. That's what happened. Exactly. That's exactly what happened. But that's rare in many different contexts that people will own that community, feel like they really belong, and stay. Because we have people coming in from Indiana, from Oklahoma, from California, from Michigan, from Mexico, from all over these different places.
Right.
Some from Phoenix, different places in Arizona, but people stayed because they really agreed with the vision, the purpose.
And that's particularly interesting for something that started as a college ministry, because I feel like oftentimes those are marketed and pivoted in a very specific way, where it's like once you get out of college, it's hard to stay. Do you know what I mean? So the fact that this came out of this college ministry and produced something that had people staying, it is interesting to me.
Right. Yeah, it's really crazy. So I mean, in the meantime, I was up in Colorado, so I was somewhat watching this all go down from afar. These people getting married, having kids, and me being in grad school going, what in the world is happening? Right? Like, these people are crazy. Like, but I mean, they were the people that I knew already, so it wasn't easily dismissed.
Yeah. And so what brought you back then to Tucson?
It was this group of people. Yeah, this church. Like, that's why I wanted to be. Yeah, it says a lot. Yeah, and some of us have that same story. So there was a couple that went up to Seattle area and came back. There was a couple that went out to Detroit and came back. There was a couple that briefly went out to California and came back. I was up in Colorado. I found my wife and got married up there, but then came back.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that. And, some of them had kids while they were gone and came back. Others of them, like me, met a spouse and then came back.
Yeah, but there's that repeated pattern of like coming back and this anchoring that's grown from this little tiny thing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and everybody that, well, not literally everybody, but a lot of people in the church at this point, we're just committed to being here forever. I bought like I said, as I said a few times in this conversation so far, I bought the house like across the street from the founding pastor. Like want to be here. I
Yeah.
want to be with this group of people, really intimately connected.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you for the background.
Yeah.
When I reached out to you, I asked you if you had anything on your mind. And you
Hmm.
said, the first thing you said is that maybe we talk about identity. So
Hmm.
I'm going to throw it off to you to kind of get started. And then, yeah, we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, so I was working on a sermon, and then I talked to a friend of mine who I hadn't talked to in, like, gosh, maybe 10 years, over FaceTime, and we were talking through what the sermon topic was going to be. It was going to be something about evangelism, but then we happened upon this idea that I've been thinking about, not just in because of its relevance to what I was going to talk about in the sermon, but it seems like we happened upon this idea that I think is pretty deep in our culture, um, which is where your identity comes from and what kind of control you have over it.
Mm.
So I think if you go back to really ancient ideas that you can see in myths and various stories and ancient philosophy, what was more common of an idea about identity is that identity was given to you. So it was unchosen and imposed upon you in a way that you didn't have any control over, although you might have some control. The control that you had was more of whether you were going to accept your fate or not. And it was a good thing if you were able to accept your fate. There's some outliers, right? There's some interesting myths and stories
Mm-hmm.
where there's more of a positive idea of not accepting your fate. But by and large, a lot of ancient cultures, and I think this is true not just of Western culture, like the Greeks or the Romans or the Babylonians or whatever. I think this is also true of many Eastern cultures, but I am less well versed about Chinese, um, Korean culture, Vietnamese culture, and so on.
Yeah, fair
Um,
enough.
but from the little I know, it seems like this fits pretty well as also. So, like, you have a kind of a Confucian ethic and philosophy, which talks a lot about your status and your stake and your fate in life being something that's given to you as it should be, and you need to accept it. That's kind of your
Mm-hmm.
primary responsibility in life, is rather than to rebel or reject, you're supposed to submit and accept. Um, but there's always been, at least in Western culture, this idea that your identity could be chosen, that you could kind of throw aside what's been given to you and fork out into some new path. Um, and I think more and more as 2,000 years, 6,000 years, however you want to count it, has progressed in Western culture, I think we're at a point in time where we think, no, identity is not given, though maybe we like to ignore the parts that are given, basically.
Sure.
We like to emphasize the parts that we get to choose. Um, Now, we like to put it in the word choose, but as I was working on this, I was like, well, I don't know if it's always such a great idea that we have here about chosen identity. I'm realizing more and more, and I think maybe some people in our culture are realizing more and more how this goes wrong, how it causes lots of craziness and anxiety and chaos and confusion for us. So I
Right.
was thinking, okay, so what's more of a negative connotation word that I could use besides given or even constructed? And I came upon fabricated. So depending on whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, you pick a certain word. So I think we think that we make our identities. So we fabricate our identities for ourselves, and we think that we have. Well, we like to think that we have total freedom and total control, and then reality happens, right? And
Yeah.
then we bump up into other people, and and so on and so forth. But this is the kernel of the idea is it's this dichotomy, it's this tension, it's this conflict between ideas of identity being given
Mm.
and then our responsibility or our choices to receive or not, right? To rebel or accept. Or our identities, maybe we get some like initial starting point or like kind of clay, and then we get to mold it however we want to, right? Like we can be whatever we want, right? Shoot for the stars. You can, yeah. You can be whatever you want to be, right? Like,
It's very
so
American.
right. It's extremely American. It is a very European in some ways. Not every European culture emphasizes it as strongly, but certainly Americans do. Yeah. So I've been kind of playing with this idea. I think it goes to the root of some of the major things that we're grappling with in our culture.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. A couple months back, I had a conversation with my friend Christian, and we were talking about deconstruction and his sort of, his thoughts about the matter was that a lot of this deconstruction we're seeing, particularly with young Christians and evangelical movements, has a lot to do with identity and the way that they define themselves and how they see themselves as defined. And I mean, it's been interesting for me as, I obviously came from an evangelical background, deconstructed, and then stayed Christian, but obviously went a much more traditional route. And there was a part of it where it was like, well, I chose that path, but it also feels somewhat fated. Like, what else could I have chose? Like, these things stripped away from me more than I had any control over. And so you're left with this choice, but also this fate of like, yeah, I liked how you put it. Is, am I choosing the fate, or am I, giving the finger to it, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But thinking about it too, it's like I've chosen a path of orthodoxy in a way, even though in some ways I felt like I couldn't choose anything else. Yet there is this other part of me that knows, based on where I was born, how I was raised, the things I was given, there's always a part of me that's Protestant in this wiring. And it's so fascinating to think about in that dichotomy of like, what does that mean for my identity and the way that it shapes and changes me? And like, how much control do I actually have over that? Is it good to try to take control over that and morph it to your own fate? Or is there something, some bigger thing going on? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because some of our biggest stories, we like to have both of these be true in some way that it all comes together to some satisfying whole or conclusion. So we, just think about great romance stories. Well, some of them aren't even great, but they're romance stories. So like the girl wants it to be the case that she's fated and destined for some brilliant, great, excellent man in some way. I don't know. But at the same time, the story often starts with an arranged marriage or some kind of imposition of a guy that she has not chosen.
Mm.
So this is not always the case going way back in time. Like if you look at The Little Mermaid, it's basically like the original Little Mermaid, not the Disney version. Are you familiar with the original Little Mermaid?
I have. You're gonna have to remind me, because I have watched commentaries on it.
Okay.
But it's not right in my head where I'm like, yes, definitely.
That's actually a really good one to see the change in culture over time. So you've got about like 100-year distance between the two stories. So you've got the original Little Mermaid, where she is, she lives underwater, right? She's a mermaid, right? She has this whole world that's offered to her underwater, and she decides she's going to reject it, and because she falls in love with this human guy, right? And she makes all these deals and stuff, and she eventually becomes a human, or at least takes on human form, where she has two legs and the whole thing. But it does not end up working out for her. So the human guy like doesn't accept her and love her in the way that she wants and imagines it would have been at first, and she ends up killing herself. Ta-da! Right? Like, okay, so the story is supposed to illustrate that one should accept one's fate and lot in life and not go pining after and fawning over some lofty, ridiculous, out of this world experience, right? Contrast that with the Disney version, right? 100 years later, and the Disney version is all about how if you reach for your dreams and you really believe, and you can be part of a whole nother world, right? Like, just if you want to and you believe hard enough and you're really good and, you know, yeah, and you make a deal with a witch and but your father's really good anyway, so he makes up for it,
Well,
Which
this sort of, yeah, love conquers all, like true
love
love,
conquers all, right,
happily
right,
ever
right, right.
after.
hmm but it's interesting because I think this is a good example of where we like both of them coming together because her choices lead to a disaster that the God figure of the story, right? Her father with the big white beard, right? And the trident that has magical powers, right? Like, um, he's able to set everything straight.
Mm.
So, like, fate and God, right, is able to orchestrate and affirm her choices.
It's interesting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because
Right. So,
in the original one, right, he falls in love with another woman, like he
mhm.
does in the Little Mermaid, but he actually marries her, and then isn't it that she accepts the fate to like kill herself, go into the sea, and she becomes like the sea foam, and like it's supposed
Yep.
to be this reminder of the pain and the anguish that she took on for this person that she loved in, the sacrifice of herself.
Yep. Exactly.
Different story, different outcome.
Yeah. Very different. Very, very different. Right. Yeah. What's the whole thing that breaks the like witch's curse thing in the Disney version? I don't know. I should have studied up on this if I was really going to use it
There,
as my.
so there was I just watched The Little Mermaid on the plane.
Oh, nice.
So I remember it. She had the
The live
voice.
action version or the.
No, I don't think is the
Okay.
live action out yet.
I'm pretty sure it is. I'm pretty sure
Oh,
it's been out for
no,
like a couple years now.
no, I watched the
No one
cartoon.
really liked it. Yeah, no one really liked it.
It's been controversial. We won't talk about that. Uh, um, but she had the little shell on her neck where her voice was kept, and the seagull, like all of the animals, were like on her side, and they got this, um, uh, what do you call it? The shell, and they broke it, and then the voice went back into her, and so then she sang, and he was
Oh, right, right, right.
brought out of it and realized, oh, this is not the woman I loved who saved me from the ocean.
Right, exactly. Okay, so right. So there's an interesting like given versus chosen thing. So there's this sense that the voice belongs to her, right? Properly speaking, right? As in like it should be hers. It's given to her. She starts out with it, right? And the witch steals it, takes it, claims it as
Mhm.
her own, right? Which is it's interesting how what we portray as the evil, right? Decrepit, depraved thing versus what we portray as the good, right, heroic thing. Because like there's I can think of plenty of stories, so long as you weren't stealing it, as long as we could kind of shade the story so that um, you're not exactly stealing the voice,
Right.
right? We would love a story. It could even be a Disney story, a Pixar story, where somebody like creates a different voice for themselves, right? And how heroic and brave and you know yeah, you're finding your voice, right? Oh, yeah, man, that's even a great phrase right there. Look, you found your voice. You're so empowered because you took the voice you had and you made the voice that you really wanted, that really belonged to you. Okay, anyway, I'm just saying we could make a hero out of the witch
Mm-hmm.
because we love the idea of fabricating our identity so much. Um, but in the Little Mermaid story, the current one by Disney, the animated one, yeah, the releasing of the voice from the witch back to who it really belongs then sets everything right. I mean, or it starts to anyway.
Right.
It brings back the trident Neptune, godlike, the god character who then really is able to set things right. But yeah, so it's interesting because you have this choice and the choice is affirmed and it's good and it's positive and it's kind of like what we think should be the case. We love it, um, we praise it, and we get into it. And then at the same time, part of what's redeeming in the story is that things go back to the given, right? Things go back to the way they were supposed to be originally set as, right? The king is the king. The person who had the voice to start with gets the voice back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we love when they come together in some harmonious fashion where choice and fate you know.
Collide.
Exactly, right. So the woman gets out of the unchosen given arrangement, but she she has this power of choice, but with her power of choice, she chooses the somehow fated destined guy, right? So it's like it's weird because she's choosing out of something she's given into something that in some sense is like more supernaturally or at a higher level given.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder where you think this change comes from, because I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly with like the films, you know, we grew up with as kids, where in many ways it feels like movies are the modern myth, where they're telling us these stories, they're giving us hints to morality, all of these things. And so you grow up watching these things for entertainment, but all of a sudden, without us even knowing, it's rewiring the way we think and the values that we put in, and the endpoint in which we make choices with. And when you look at women my age, we grew up with all of these Disney films where it was sort of this certain idea of what a princess is, what the role of a woman is, what we should want, and, you know, looking for that happy ending. And then as we got older, the story started changing, and all of a sudden it started changing almost with ourselves too, because we're noticing how the world is not quite the reality in which is painted in these sort of picturesque stories. So, I mean, where do you think that shift came, where identity went from being the thing, you know, accept the thing that you're fated to define it on your own terms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And like I said, you can see even the roots of this in some of the ancient Greek myths going way, way, way back. I mean, you can see this in aspects of Bible stories. I mean, it's all, I feel like the overall or the dominant idea is that you should accept what you're given. And I'm not sure exactly where the tipping point where it goes into choice is the really good thing goes, but it's not like it's a complete on-off switch. It's not like you never see it and then all of a sudden you see it. But I've spent a fair amount of time studying existentialist philosophy and the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard, and then later Jean-Paul Sartre, and these guys portray, and then and a really interesting character who really got me into this way, realizing that this is what's coming out in a culture so much is not Sartre, but actually Simone de Beauvoir, his like mistress lover. They had such a tangled relationship, but that's actually part of the point. If you know some of their biography, I think it illustrates a lot about the philosophy. It's one thing to hear the ideas, and it's another to pair the ideas with the personalities and go, wow, okay, so this is the life. This is a life that might be lived in this philosophy. Because existentialism has a huge, huge, huge influence on cinema starting in the 50s and goes till today. Like a lot of the experimental films that were being created in the 50s and 60s were people who were reading Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and then making movies. Like it was just like from one to the other. It was, yeah, right.
Well,
is this something you're familiar with?
Well, in some, I don't, you know, being a filmmaker, I took film history classes, and the recognition of these weird experimental films that happened in the 50s and 60s eventually led to be what is mainstream now. So all these things that we consider just normal in our everyday cinema, they all came from these weird existential films that nobody watches, nobody cares about. Yet there's these pieces of them that come, and the history of film is so interesting to me, the way they build things up, and you know, even the way that the acknowledgement of the camera and the more acceptance of that changes the way we make. Like in our psychology is very interesting, but I don't know much about the lives of a lot of these experimental films, but I know exactly the films you're talking about because I watched some of them.
Okay, cool. So it's a true and somewhat deep connection there between this strain of philosophy and then the art that's created.
Mm.
And there are some similar ties if you look at sculpture or visual art at the same time period. But I think the visual art and sculpture was more the painting and stuff. It's weird. That actually went before, I think, in many ways. It came before the philosophy was like articulated in words.
Mm.
But what's interesting about the film is that the words from Sartre, for example, came prior to the film. So you can see the thinking then impacting the art rather than the art being kind of like a prefigured expression that then was able to be articulated in words.
Right.
So one of the key ideas of existentialism is that what makes you human, most of all, is your ability to freely choose who you are and what you are. So one of the little bumper sticker phrases from Sartre was that existence precedes essence. So that is what the fact that you exist and are alive is something that comes before what kind of thing or what kind of characteristics you have. And this is uniquely true of humans, that it's in a way that's not true of animals or plants or, inorganic matter and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's both a curse and a blessing. So you have a kind of radical freedom to choose the kind of being that you want to be as a human being. And so you can see, oh, wow, this is all choice. This is all fabrication of identity, right? Like you're given existence, but existence is like a blank slate. You get to decide from there who you want to be in any way that you possibly could think of. And Simone de Beauvoir, who was it's hard to say whether she was really a first or a second wave feminist, but I mean, she's kind of like one of the big transition points from first to second wave feminism, picks
Mm-hmm.
this up and says, yeah, this has been up to this point, women have been given, imposed upon, oppressed by all of the things that are just default true about them and what makes for a good life for women. And she says this way, so don't hammer me on this. Like she
Don't
actually
worry.
says it this way. Okay, but I mean, like I'm just saying for the audience as well that might be
Yeah.
listening to this.
I
I'm
won't
not
do it at
intending
all.
to. Right, I'm not intending to be inflammatory. I'm like this is how she tends to talk about it, which seems kind of strange to other strains of feminism. If you're not
Mm-hmm.
familiar with de Beauvoir, she basically says the key to freedom for women is to become men, because men are not as tied down to the givens of life, right? They're not as tied down to their biology. And this is where you can see it's not that it wasn't there before, but you can see a really big influence coming out of Simone de Beauvoir about abortion being a necessity for feminism, birth control being a necessity for feminism, right? Like you need to be freed from your fundamental biology. Like that's actually something that's tying you down and oppressing you. So it's not even men. The idea of a patriarchy was not quite as emphasized in de Beauvoir. I mean, she's really like railing against nature itself,
Yeah.
right? So you need to have the ability to live life like a man in order to be truly free, and men are able to just like choose whatever they want. They can be whatever they want, right? If they want to be a pirate, they want to be a surgeon, they want to be a waiter at a restaurant, like they just go do it. Women have all these like difficulties that are holding them back, some imposed by culture, but some given to you by nature. And that's a bad thing, right? So you see the shift from, hey, you are a woman, and what you need to do is accept that in ways that you can kind of make your own. And that's a virtuous thing to do. That process of coming to accept womanhood is a virtuous thing, where de Beauvoir says, no, that's oppression, right? Anyone who tells you that you should accept that is oppressing you. You need to free yourself. Yeah. So that's really where I've seen a lot of this play out, is in the feminism going into gender, which goes even beyond like the kind of the sexism. Now we have the gendered stuff, and then transgender, transsexual. Like this is where it really catapults beyond what I think even people would have imagined 100 years ago.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to kind of hear that phraseology of like the way she would talk about it is we have to become men, like in a certain sense, right? Where when I look at a lot of the stories that are told, particularly in my industry, it does feel like we're trying to put women in male stories instead of like taking what is interesting and intrinsically different about women and the way that we can see the world differently. We're trying to fight the game that men play by playing by their rules and playing in their speed. And I'm like, I don't know if that's going to be the most successful way to tell female stories and put females in the industry. Because there's something so complicated about the idea of womanhood, and like there is these differences, and there's obviously a range of differences of how women express themselves. And for myself, even, I feel like a much more masculine woman than most women. You know, I'm feminine and I like pretty things, but I still have a lot of more masculine tendencies. And I think it's why, in a lot of ways, I've thrived in more masculine industries. Yet, there was still something that could recognize there is that difference. And I don't think playing the game on the male standard is going to give the impact of what we want in this idea of like bringing women into the industry and like telling female stories. There's something different. And I think I've been personally struggling that with a lot, you know, as I get older and recognizing, oh, hey, there's this story that I've been told about what I'm supposed to be as a woman. I can have it all. And, you know, you get older, you know, Peterson talks about this, like women between 28 and 35 tend to have this crisis now where it's like you have to choose career or family. And you know, I did that before I ever heard Peterson talk about that, where it's like, you know, 28 comes along and you go, what am I doing? What is it, you know, and that came with a lot of other things that were changing, like becoming more becoming orthodox and trying to figure out what it is to participate in faith and be a woman doing that as opposed to, you know, a man. And yeah, there's something interesting about the way that feminism, that idea of like trying to make women more like men, like it's built into the bottom or some of the beginnings of feminism.
Some of the beginnings, yeah. It's a very complicated story. So
sure. Yeah,
I've been I've intentionally oversimplified it because
yes.
I think we're trying to pull on this one particular thread of this idea of accepting what's given versus choosing and even rejecting what's given. And one has been valorized and the other has been said to be like evil and oppressive more recently. And that seems to be the more dominant stories, the more dominant ideas.
Yeah, but in some ways, like the way it's come now, it seems like we talk out of both sides of our mouth.
Yeah, and we always have, is I guess my point. And so the best stories are ones that somehow manage to harmonize.
Weird paradox.
That. Yeah. Well, there's a paradox, but we recognize that it's an apparent contradiction, and what we find really satisfying is when we're able to make harmony between two apparently on the surface contradictory ideas.
Well, that's very interesting, because how many apparent contradictions do you think have more harmony than we give them credit?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, male and female seems like one where we love to play with that, yes. But we're playing with it differently, I guess, is my point today, is that we're playing with it in the sense that biological men can be women and biological women can be men, like we or, you know, a woman can have all these masculine traits, and that's a good thing, right? Like, and stuff like that. And it's not that I necessarily even disagree with some of that last part, but
sure.
But what used to be the dance was that, like, how can these two very different beings like come together for harmonious life or adventure or romance? That used to be the way that things went down. So you can see this in some of Shakespeare's story where there are women who are struggling with being women. So like Taming of the Shrew would be an example that some feminists really, really hate for various. Are you familiar with that one? Taming of the Shrew?
No, I'm not. I mean, I've heard the name, but I don't actually know what it's about.
Have you seen 10 Things I Hate About You?
I've seen pieces.
Okay. All right. Well,
I'll go
that
watch
movie
it. I'll go
basically
watch
is,
it this weekend.
well, it's funny. I used to teach at a Christian school, and I showed that movie as a like modern reflection of Taming of the Shrew because we were doing Shakespeare at the time. I got in trouble for showing 10 Things I Hate About You. It just goes to show that yeah. Anyway, um, so that story is a modern retelling of Taming of the Shrew, and they definitely put a more feminist spin on things. But the original story is one where a woman is extremely masculine and rebellious and does not want to live up to her kind of her unchosen, imposed cultural standard of being a woman in, I guess, 1600s, 1600s England / Italy. Because the story supposedly takes place in Italy, but it's an English guy, Shakespeare, putting together the story. So you see that play out, but by the end, she's accepted her role as a proper wife through a series of different events. And yeah.
So I can see why people would not like that.
Exactly. Right. But there's kind of so modern retellings of this story kind of play with how much of does she really submit, or is she doing it ironically? Is she doing it sarcastically? Can we even just go beyond the script altogether and be like 10 Things I Hate About You, where she's very much more of a modern kind of girl power kind of person, sure. And yet she also gets the guy. So I mean, like, so it's interesting to watch the kind of progression of a Shakespeare story, or like I said, is it Hans Christian Andersen, I think, is the guy who does the original Little Mermaid into the Disney version, and then the even more current Disney version.
Have you seen the most current Disney version? Did they change a lot about it?
I don't think they so much changed a lot. I didn't bother to see it after I think I saw the Lion King live action version, and I was like, I didn't think that really needed to be made, like, so I don't know.
So much money though.
Right. Well, of course they
make stupid amounts of money. Well, because the parents, everybody's nostalgic. So like, oh, I want to see it. And then the kids will bring their parents, or the parents will bring their kids to it, or maybe vice versa,
Sure.
Right. For entertaining. But yeah, I haven't found them super entertaining necessarily. I mean, I'll watch them and it's like fine enough, but.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about what you're telling, like living life as a woman between ages 20 and 35, I don't know if some of it is even portrayed to women as something even to consider. Like fundamental aspects of biological reality are not even, I mean, they're talked about, but they're not really talked about. So they're talked about as things to be avoided. So like ninth grade biology class, or like, somewhere between 6th and 9th grade, you get information about birth control and sex. And basically it's like, don't screw up your life by getting pregnant. Like that is like the dominant theme.
Well,
right?
I think it's changing now.
Okay.
I think in some ways it's like, these are your options, but I don't think they make judgments.
That's not what I heard, but of course I heard it as a guy anyway. And I can tell you that's not what people. I do wonder who's going to end up listening to this, but I'm going to go ahead and risk it. So I have peers. I have women who I graduated high school with who are now turning 40, just like I did in September. And they don't have kids. They're not married. And that is just not going to happen for them. And for many of them, they didn't. For all the value that we place on choice, they didn't really choose that in some ways. And it's not that they didn't ever have the opportunity to choose others. It's that they were given, like you said, this storytelling, right? This myths, these cinema, the philosophy, the go to college, have a career messaging that was super dominant among me and all of my peers from 6th to 9th grade and then beyond. But especially those like 6th to 9th grade. I mean, you go back and listen to some of with this mindset, like these idea of like choice versus accepting what you can give, and you look at some of those Disney stories, and how many of those stories are all about choosing whatever you can be, whatever you want to be, right? Like you could be the president of the United States, you could be an astronaut, right?
Well, even
In particular, I wanted to be an astronaut.
Yeah.
But
well, like you even look at the more modern ones like Brave, you can even choose whether you end up with the guy or not. And that's
yes,
a new story, right? Because
right.
for us, it was like we had all these stories of like you fall in love, you chase the prince above all adversity, and then you get married and happily ever after. And then, you know, in our lives, how many of our friends and families, parents are getting divorced? You're hitting the reality of, you know, what does happily ever after look like? You kind of get this idealized version of marriage, and then that starts reflecting in the films that come out afterwards. Where I think we got to give a more realistic expectation about reality and all these things. And
right,
you know, on one hand, it's understandable. On the other hand, it's like there's complications with all of it and the way that we're portraying things and what values are we putting on these things. And I mean, I look at myself. Right. I grew up in a Christian home that valued marriage, and, you know, valued young marriage, but it was like, don't date anybody until you're 18 and then marry the first person you date. Like that was sort of like the unspoken pressure. Well, sometimes spoken pressure, where it was like, why are you dating in high school? That's, you know, and it's funny enough, my younger sister was actually only one of us who dated in high school, and she married him. But like there was this different pressure, and so for me, it went from this place of like, okay, that's what I want, in a sense of like, I'd like to be married. I like the idea of that, but I'm also, you know, what does that mean? And that's that's a big step, and kind of thinking that, and also chasing something bigger than myself. And then, you know, almost got married and it didn't happen. And then that went through a whole crisis of like, oh, well, you know, what does it really mean to be married, and the process of that? And, you know, maybe am I supposed to be single my whole life? Maybe that's a better path. And you can even look at the Bible and say it's good to be single and all of these things. And then I think I got to a certain age, 26, 27, and I just realized, as much as I want to try to do the right thing, and, you know, if singleness is the call, that's it. But I don't think I'm actually better alone. So what does that mean? I have to like figure out how to open myself up to that. And, you know, I'm married now. So it certainly took me on a journey, and it worked out. But there was that sort of like fighting and that pressure of like, there's that modern tale of like, I'm going to make something of myself, and I'm going to have it all, and I'm going to do all these things. And, you know, I chased that in a lot of ways, because like, what else was I going to do? I wasn't in any mental space to get married. I couldn't think about the idea of getting married. And so I stayed single and chased the career. And it made me miserable. I mean, not so, fully. Yeah. Like there's still things I'm very proud of, and I'm glad I did it, and I learned things from it, and it prepared me to take this other step. But in a lot of ways, it drove me crazy. And so there's that question of like, okay, I have to accept the fate of what it is to be a woman. What does that mean? I have no idea. Because right. It's not clear anymore. And I mean, maybe it never was clear. Maybe there was always some kind of question to that, but it's really hard to understand what it is to accept the fate in a certain sense.
Yeah, I I think the way that most of the stories that we tell each other in our culture, including history textbooks, by the way. So it's not even like fanciful things. I mean, it's when we get down to what we think are the really hard and fast facts. The way we narratorize, right? I just made that word up, but like the way we would make a story out of these histories is to say it used to be the case that womanhood was extremely clear and oppressive, right? And then it was a good thing that we made it unclear because then it was less oppressive, and now everyone is living happily ever after, able to do everything that they've ever wanted to. Like that's the story. Right? Or maybe there's still some lingering things that are very clear and oppressive that we still need to do away with. Right.
Yeah.
But we're like things are getting better. Yeah, anyway.
I mean, it's a hard dynamic because there's some parts of the sort of idea of like the set model of what it is to be a woman that didn't feel right, that felt fabricated.
That were oppressive. Yeah.
Yes. Yet
or
there's
false even. Yeah.
Yeah. Yet there's this other part where it's like now we've gone to this other extreme where being a woman is whatever you want it to be. Like even to the point of choosing that. And you're lost. You're like, well, even if I do believe I'm fated into something and I want to accept that fate, to make the choice to accept that fate, what is the fate? You know, there's there's not a clear answer. And in a lot of ways, the answers that you're getting in modern media is become like men.
It's very subtle though. They a lot of times they won't come out and say that, but if you kind of think through the implications of it, you're like, wow, that really is the case.
Well, I think I saw this particularly when it came to sort of the sexualization of people in films, where for so long you had women being, you know, the voyeuristic tendencies of men and the sexualization of women in these films, and it was a bad thing for the longest time, where like we got to treat women with respect. But all of a sudden we have the switch, and now we've got Magic Mike movies and this idea where, well, women take on the voyeuristic tendencies that men have, and we should date like men, and we shouldn't be ashamed of the things we've been telling men, well, that men got away with more, but you know, generally society was not happy with. And it switched where it's like, okay, these things that were always sort of happening to women that we weren't really happy with, when it comes to the other side and switching the power dynamic, all of a sudden it's like, well, we're even playing field. And some of that I think comes with this postmodernism of like, well, morals don't even matter. So live how you want, live hedonistically. So it in some ways it makes some sense, particularly if you don't have a religious grounding or any sort of arrow that you identify with to help cling to or point you somewhere. But it doesn't seem to actually be moving us forward in the way we think it is, where it's like we're changing this one thing and calling it woman empowerment, when 50 years ago, well, there were women through that system that were being oppressed by men to do those things. It's complicated.
Right. It is very. One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking was that the idea of reversal and kind of flipping things upside down. And this is a theme that you see through a lot of kind of Marxist strains of thought. And then postmodernism also picks it up. Someone like Derrida really likes the idea of opposites, kind of like, or negations, assuming each other, and that part of what you need to do to release from oppression is to just flip things around. And so you see a lot of that being portrayed in film that way, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes really subtly. But the other thing that I think is maybe a particularly American problem, I don't know if Europeans have quite as much of a problem with this, is Europeans do like a lot of their stories to end tragically. Or or maybe if they don't like them, they expect them to, or something like that. I don't have a really good grasp as like, it's not like I am a European to kind of articulate what the sense is there.
Right.
But they're happy with people making a heroic choice and having it not live happily ever after at the end. So they still oftentimes are in this existentialist, like choice is good way of thinking, but they're willing to portray the end result as being something that doesn't end up well, right? Everything, everything goes badly at the end. And whereas Americans tend to have the same value on choice, right? We're still going to make choice a virtue and choosing whatever you want, the virtuous path. But then everything works out. Like not only do you get what you chose, but you get the other thing that you didn't choose too. And, like you get the whole menagerie, you get the whole everything. Right?
Yeah. I wonder if part of that has to do with some of our history where we chose to leave and we chose to fight and we won. Right. And then we chose to expand to the far ends from sea to shining sea, and we won.
Sure.
And so there's that sort of unspoken pattern within our history where it's like, break the conventions, make the choice, make your own destiny, and you'll win.
Yeah. So, but this is a Peterson idea. It's not just him, but like that doesn't really work for women. You were talking about this window of 20 to 35, right? It's like, so you're taught, like I was saying, from 6th to 9th grade, pregnancy will ruin your life. Why? Because your life is defined ever so subtly or maybe very explicitly as your career, right? Going to college, then working in a corporate world or becoming an entrepreneur or, making a lot of money, climbing up the ladder, right?
Yeah.
Doing something that puts a dent in the world, right? Making these fantastic films that change everybody's ideas, whatever, right? Like you're going to make this big famous name for yourself, which has been in the past stereotypically a masculine man's way to live, right? But importantly, that is life. Like that's when you think life, that's your life, right? So pregnancy ruins your life, right? It ruins your career.
Yeah.
And then we expect somehow for women to turn around whenever they feel like it, basically, sometime in their late 30s, maybe early 30s, and then just like have kids. Like all of a sudden a man materializes that the man is their dreams. They haven't sought him out. They haven't had to work on like being the kind of person that can be in a relationship. They just like, I don't know, choose one off the shelf, right? At the Walmart or Target or, whatever, like, I feel like, okay, that one, right? And then he likes me for me and finds me attractive and I don't have to do any work and we have kids and we have no trouble conceiving. There's no miscarriages. There's no misunderstandings. There's no marital unfaithfulness, right? Right. And my career has no problem with this somehow. And right, there are no trade-offs with our choices is the myth. Right. There's no downside to anything here.
Yeah. Well, and our biology doesn't catch up to our ideals, right? Like even with IVF and some of these things that women have tried to utilize to keep the fertilization window open and all those things, they're not as successful as you think. Even birth control is not as successful as you think. And that's why we have the rise in sort of single motherhood and unmarried pregnancies, which is why I think with sex ed now it's changing where pregnancy doesn't ruin your life because they don't want to put that stigma if you get pregnant outside of marriage that your life is ruined or something. So there's more of like a laissez-faire, but there's still very much of like a prevent pregnancy. And I mean it makes your life harder. It certainly narrows your choices. Like my younger sister got married at 21, had her first baby at 21. She's got 3 kids now, another one on the way. My life, very different than hers. I got to travel the world and live in different places. I got to get a film degree and make movies. But like in some ways it's like I'm glad I did those things. Like I don't regret that I did those things, and I think it prepared me for a different path. And like in some ways it prepared me to understand what it is to get married and face the facts of like the reality of what that is. Yet I recognize, if I have a kid, my life's going to be very different. My motherhood's
Right.
going to be very different than hers.
Right.
And it's not a good or bad thing, but it's like a trade-off. And
Exactly. Right.
there's something of like, there's something nice about the path she chose to have those kids. And like, I love her children to death, and they've taught me so much just being their aunts. Like it taught me so much about what it is to be human. And
Sure.
there's in some ways I wonder if she feels like she's missing out, because she didn't get to do all those things. She was a stay-at-home mom. But in a lot of ways, like I think when we hit 40, we're the people in my position, or even worse, who just didn't settle down, didn't have kids. I wonder if we're gonna think differently, and wish we had been more traditional.
Yeah. So the advice, the wisdom that Peterson and others like him or inspired by him are trying to say is that chances are you're an average person with average desires and will on average be fulfilled by the kinds of things that have always fulfilled human beings going back and farther and farther in the past, right? So
Yeah.
so chances are you're gonna want to have kids. The best place to raise kids is within a committed, married relationship. So like maybe prioritize that, right? Like you might be the exception, you might, but chances are you're not, right? So that's kind of the thought. And I don't think that's that's not the messaging I picked up in those formative years.
Mm.
It's not that message
No.
wasn't out there. It was there to be heard if you were looking for it, but and in certain pockets of different places of
Yeah.
subcultures, but it was not what I was told, and it was not what my peers in high school were told.
Well, it's weird because it was what I was told, but I was also in a very conservative evangelical Christian bubble, and I was always the outlier. Like in some ways, I lived a somewhat modern life, but I was always traditional. I was always, I didn't date around. I was always going to church. I was doing all these things, but living this sort of more odd modern life. So I didn't quite fit in the church group or the secular group, right? But yeah, I think if I had a different upbringing, if I had a different background, I don't even know if I would think about these questions of gender, sexuality, and be willing to question the sort of feminist model,
Right.
that has become so prominent. And like, I don't have
Sure.
anything inherently against feminism. I think the tenets underneath it are very well intended, and like there's a lot of things that I can agree with, of like, the dignity and respect of all genders, no matter what. But yeah, it's just become so complicated. It's where it's hard, where it's like I can't call myself a feminist because that word has so much baggage, and that means so many different things to different people. Even if I do want to see equality in the world of like even like equality of opportunity,
Sure. Yeah. So the other thing that you mentioned something like a fear, blah, 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 blah. And I don't remember exactly the way you put it, but automatically the way that it was like in my head is the fear of missing out. Right. So you talk to so many people, especially people even younger than us today. And that is part of their ever going all consuming reality, is that they're afraid of missing out. And the other thing that even I experienced as a millennial was this paralysis of choice. There's just literally too many choices, and it's overwhelming. It's anxiety producing.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that has been discovered and really proved over and over again as people go to build like software interfaces, human to machine interfaces, is that humans really can't deal with more than 5 choices, maybe at the high end 7, but we actually kind of really like 3 choices. So it's the rule is 5 plus or minus 2.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes you'll see 7 plus or minus 2, but I mean, it's like in this ballpark, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the sweet spot where we feel like we've been given all the choices we could ever want. And it feels really satisfying that we ourselves got to choose our own destiny, but it's been constrained because in a lot of cases, the software could give you many more choices. It's some programmer has to choose to constrain that down so you don't become overwhelmed and paralyzed and you're like, I don't even know where to start, right? Have you ever like gone to the pasta aisle at like a really big grocery store and you're like, I just want pasta. And you're like, how many different kinds of spaghetti do I need to choose from, right? Like,
or you go to one of those department stores like Forever 21 where they have the big, like all these racks of clothing, and it's like, I don't even want to look because there's too many clothes everywhere. Give me less options.
Right. So that's what's crazy is that you go rewind, I don't know, 100 years, 50 years, even at this point, maybe rewind like 20 years. And that's what we're saying as millennials and Gen Z. We're like, please constrain my choice for me. Or we want that at some level and we kind of understand there's something wrong with how many choices we're given, and yet we still can't break out of the cultural messaging that says choice is always good and more choices is better.
Well, it's hard too with the way globalization has changed the face of like culture and how we understand it, where all of a sudden what may have 100 years ago been you being the best at something in your community, now you go on the internet, swipe on TikTok, you're always going to find somebody better. And so there's this debilitating feeling of like, well, I can't even master whatever craft I have an interest in or, feel pulled towards. And that's an overwhelming feeling. And it's this double-edged sword where how many beautiful things did we get from expanding our world and knowing more cultures and, being able to buy products from all these different places. Yet here we are, debilitated by choices, not intentional with our money or our time or our life. And we don't know how to stop it. It's like this feedback loop.
Right. So I think we are running into the trade-off of going full in the direction of choice, more choice, always choice. Choice is always good.
Yeah.
And it's surprising for a lot of people that could ever be the consequence. But like I said, there's some real tragedy here because you don't get to go back and rewind and make different choices. Like, I mean, so one of the people that gets oftentimes not talked about in existentialist inspired film is Soren Kierkegaard, who says like you're condemned to be free, right? It's not like this pleasant, yay, fun thing, right? It's like no, it's anxiety producing. You're twisted and anguished about it. And you still, like I said, you still see some of this in a lot of European storytelling. But for whatever reason, us Americans wanted all the choice and none of the trade-off. And this is always true that we want all of the choice and none of the trade-off, but we just stopped even being realistic in how that's portrayed in our stories and our myths. But life is like that. Like you choose to have a career, that means for me, I'll have one kid, but I'll be lucky if I get 2. Right? So I never imagined myself wanting to have kids, and I never imagined myself wanting to have more than 2 kids. But if I somehow wanted to have more than 2 kids at this point in my life, unless we're going to start practicing polygamy, I mean, this is not a choice for me, right? Like,
right.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, anyway, that's a huge one. That's a really, really big one.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, if some of the like, I guess you could call it realism that's reflected in the film of like Americans don't show a lot of trade-offs. I wonder if it again has to do with history of like you look at the 40s what films were they making? The Italian neorealists, where they're in war-torn Europe. We fought in the war, but it was somewhat removed from us, so we didn't feel fully the trade-offs of what that was. And so there's much more of that built into the DNA to accept that, where we're a bunch of idealists, and what did we do to the war? We made a bunch of musicals, some big Hollywood musicals to get into that escapism. And so I think there's something about that culture that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think when we're kind of, and going back to feminism a little bit, when we talk about some of the myths that are built in there, I think one of the big myths that we bought wholesale was the fact that men had it better than women. Where it's like, yeah, men had more choice, but they were also going to war and working 40 hours, like, or more, how many hours a week? Like, there's that question of like, I don't know. I don't think we ask ourselves, is it necessarily better to be at the top, have all the power, have all that responsibility? Is it better to work in the field and never be home and never see your kids? It's a necessity in the modern frame that we live, but better and worse, I think, I don't think we're being fair with those terms, or at least discriminating enough and discerning enough with those terms, because they're different. But I don't think men in general were always happy with the cards they were dealt in the roles they had.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's not like I have been as confused about my gender as many other peers of mine, or even students that I've taught as a teacher or a tutor, but or even people in my church. But yeah, like, I was raised with feminism just as much as my female peers, and so that made me figuring out masculinity pretty difficult at times. And for some of the same reasons. So there's a lot of kind of self-hatred that comes out of that. That I think I'm mostly beyond at this point, but I mean, there was a period of time where it was like I was identified as the oppressor. Right. And that was an identity thrust onto me, and there was this idea, and there still is, kind of, that's like a cosmic kind of justice, right? Like, yeah, Michael gets it now because he represents all of manhood for the last 10,000 years of human history or something like that. So suck it up.
Well, that was a hard part of me being a woman and watching some of the feminism stuff happen, where it was like, we can't deny that there has been oppression to women, and that there is a different dynamic with women than men in certain times of history, right? Like, I'm not going to deny that and say that there wasn't patterns that I'm glad don't still exist. Yet there's a whole different story to then say, well, the burden is on modern men to take all of that burden and repay everything that happened before. And there's also this sort of naivete that, well, women wouldn't have been as tyrannical or oppressive in different ways if the roles were reversed and we were on top. It's like women can't do anything wrong, and men are the evil parasites, and I'm a strong, independent woman, I don't need you. It's like, well, it doesn't quite seem, it seems like another extreme that is, again, minimizing the dignity of a gender. And I'm so sympathetic to the complications of that, and the anger and the frustration and fear and all the negative emotions with the dynamics of men and women and the way that they play out, and oppression that has happened to both. But yeah, it creates these funky ways that we participate in it, and that was hard for me, where it was like, I know as a woman in filmmaking, I can get grants that men just can't. Like I understand why they're doing it, but is that fair? I don't know.
Right. So I actually have one particular person that I know who got into a school that I didn't get into coming out of high school. And I know why she got in. And it wasn't because she was smarter or more accomplished than me.
Yeah.
So so that has been a reality of my life, seeing the way that various affirmative action policies have opened doors for people that they were not open for me.
Yeah.
In fact, they were sometimes purposefully closed in my face.
Mm.
But it's not so much that's really focusing my thought at the moment, although that has been, gosh, man, I have some resentments that I still need to probably deal with better about that. But it's the fact that we're both squabbling with each other, like man and woman are squabbling with each other, pointing fingers back at each other, and meanwhile, reality, nature is what it is. So unless we think that technology is going to solve all of our problems, which I don't believe, and even if we had it, I don't think we should use it. I think it would be deeply unethical, right, to plow ahead with some of the medical technology that we're developing. Right, like it's not my fault that women can't conceive babies very well after age 35, right? Like that's not man's oppression. Like I didn't do that, right? Like not only did I personally not do that, no man did that at all, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that we just somehow just ignored. Like we just didn't even think about it. At least people my age, like I'm saying, the peers of mine that are 40-year-old women who have had these fantastic careers, gotten their PhDs, chopped it up all over the place in boardrooms and, making money and stuff like that, inventing things, designing lasers, right? I mean, they're doing all kinds of crazy cool stuff. They're never going to have kids, right? It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and
I didn't do that. I didn't do that, and no man did, right? So
yeah. Well, that's the hard thing. I think women don't fully, it doesn't sink into them what that means not to have kids until you get older. And like a lot of, I had a lot of friends who were older than me because I just make friends with everybody. But I was one of the rare birds in sort of my friend group, my age, where, I was friends with their parents and, even people older than that, having conversations with them. And like, I think a lot of the way that our society is set up now, the age group that you're with is the age group that you're with, and you don't have a lot of that sort of cultural wisdom being passed down in these different experiences. And so at 40, you're kind of like, well, I had all this cool life, but what happens when you're 60 and you don't have a husband to help share the burdens, especially the physical burdens? You don't have kids to help support you, or you don't even have their companionship, right? Because that's as your kids get older, eventually there's a certain kind of companionship where it doesn't quite become mother-daughter, but something in the gray a little bit. And there's something that you lose that you can't you don't know you miss it till it's already gone, like far.
Right. And that's the real tragedy that American storytelling, for the most part, does not portray. And sometimes Europeans get into it, but that we don't have stories about the 45-year-old woman yet. I think those stories are coming, and I don't really relish. Like, there's some twisted part of me that relishes it. Like, yeah, finally those feminists get what was coming to them. Like serves them right. I'm just playing back the same thing that was done to me, right? Like, but there's a lot of me that is just, I know those stories are coming. They're like 5 years away, and you don't get a do-over. Like, that's just going to be life. That's going to be our culture. But I do think about, and I would love to talk about if you have any thoughts about like what the antidotes are here. Like, how can we find a better way?
That's a really good question. I think the question we should be asking, right? I mean, for me, I think the answer lies in beauty. Like, how do we recapture the beauty of what it is to like fit into these more ancient stories? Because right now it seems like modern people think ancient people were stupid and our stories are better, more beautiful, more flashy, more glamorous. And maybe to a point they are, but I think they're selling a bit of a counterfeit beauty and not the fullness of what it is in the human experience. And so for me, I think it's really, how do we recapture what the beauty of marriage is, long-term commitment, raising kids, and not in this sort of influencer way where it's like, hey, here's me and my family and we're perfect. It's like beauty, something much deeper than that. But like, that's what I think really shifted me and my view of marriage. Of like, I was very scared of it for a long time, and I honestly had somewhat of a fear and a distrust of men, for a lot of reasons, and maybe feminism was part of it. But when I really started to understand what the spiritual path of marriage was from a biblical context, because that's obviously the religion I come from. There's probably going to be different contexts from it, whatever religion you come from, but recognizing that as a spiritual path and understanding what the purpose of that spiritual path was from like an underlying force, it became so much more beautiful than sort of the ways I had heard it talked about before, where it's beneficial. You get kids from it and they're happy, and there are all these benefits to marriage, which that is also still true. But the beauty of like two people, two others coming together to understand what it is to be more human and to change each other and soften each other and sharpen each other all at the same time, that is a beautiful path. And like letting that produce life in all of these different ways is so much more appealing than I think the superficial stories we were told, where we get married to be happy and we get married for security and safety. Like those things can also be true, but not always. And it's more complicated than that, but it's also more beautiful than that.
Yeah, it's tough. I think we're really good at articulating what's wrong with marriage, and we're really good. We've just gotten, man, and a lot of this is postmodernism and neo-Marxism, but it's like we are sharply honed, knives about cutting things down, deconstructing, talking about all that's wrong with marriage, everything that's wrong with having kids, how kids are going to ruin your life, and exactly how, right? Like to the micro detail. And we are not that good at articulating what's beautiful and meaningful about these things.
Well, the truth is, kids are going to ruin your life. They're going to take the life that you had and polarize it down. But
sure,
in some ways, that can be a really beautiful thing. And like I'm being obviously a little bit of an exaggeration, because sometimes it doesn't totally change your life. But for me, like to move to a path of marriage, to pursue a path that includes kids, it changed my whole life. It took everything down and I had to cut it off. Yet I look at that and think, whatever I'm building after that is going to be so much more beautiful than the thing that I was chasing before. And like, maybe I'll have it all, maybe I won't. But either way, it's like, if I have to make the choice, like the narratives that I see after like really like parsing through it and living it, I do see marriages and kids and that life is something more beautiful than the other path. And I do think it's like reconstructing that, where it's not this, because part of me getting to that path was actually looking at a lot of marriages that weren't happy. Like when I got engaged and it broke off for a variety of reasons, and then I went through a period of like, I don't even know like what that means for me if I'm ever going to get married. And during that period where I was struggling with that, of like, maybe I'll just be single my whole life, I saw all of these marriages that were struggling. Like I saw the worst in what marriage was. Yet there was something of like facing that reality and still having the other part of what I was looking at of like what the point of marriage is. Why do we get married? What's the beauty of that? It outshone, like it shone brighter than this dark thing. And I just think if we took, if men and women took a little more time to sit down and think about it and not just accept the path that they've been taught to have from schools and media and all these things, and really sat down and thought about it for a little bit, maybe it wouldn't lead them to say, yes, I want to get married, but I think it would open them up to the idea that there's something more beautiful than is on the face of it. Because in some ways, I think a lot of people are just scared because either their parents have gotten divorced or they've seen what divorce does to kids. And that's a terrifying thing of like, why would I even take that path? And yeah, and there's that, I think there has to be that recognition of like, well, you take that path because even though it's not guaranteed that you're going to have a happy, beautiful, lovely life, there's something immensely fulfilling in the choice of marriage and like the way that it changes you to be more human.
Yeah. I think you're right about all that. I think we need to recover and start looking at old stories, ancient stories again. I think part of the reason those stories are still with us is because they were stories that we could actually live in, as opposed to some of the stories that we come up with today.
Yeah.
They're not livable stories. We can't live in them.
No.
And so that's part of the antidote, I think. I'll share part of the antidote for me, and it's where I started this conversation, is that I'm part of this really close-knit community where there's all kinds of different people of all different kinds of different ages, and we're not stratified, we're not cut off from each other in much of the way that the rest of our culture or even many of our churches are. Right? Like when you're 5 years old you're with the other 5-year-olds. When you're 15, you're with the other 15-year-olds, and you don't pay attention or don't interact with, maybe except for your teachers or something, you don't interact with people that are older or younger than you. So the church community I'm part of, I'm together with 80-year-olds, and I'm together with 2-year-olds, and I'm together with everybody in between. And so there's a opportunity for wisdom, life, modeling of life, courage to be shared. And I don't have to be as afraid of missing out because somebody else that I'm in relationship is living it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Totally.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's not that I would want to say that, oh yeah, you just live vicariously through all these other people, but there's something to that. Like, I don't have to be single because somebody else is, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Like if I'm single, I don't have to be married because other people are married. Like, we get the total expression of God's image through each tiny image bearer who has a piece. And I don't have to be a woman because I'm a man and there are other women, right? Like, I don't have to do all things. I don't have to be all people.
Yeah.
I don't have to make every possible choice.
Well, you can't. It's impossible. Like there's a lot of things where like to take one path versus the other, they're mutually exclusive. Like I can't be a modern woman, date around and, never get married. And also, do a sort of more religious evangelical path of not having any partners except the one you marry and doing that. You can't have both. And so we have to almost share our stories. And I think you're so right on about the community aspect. Because I was always, not always, there was a couple of years where I didn't have strong community, but generally most of my life I've been in church communities, stronger communities. And one, when I was in community, I lived better. But two, when I found like the Orthodox community, that shifted me in a way where it was like, you have all of these very diverse people, yet there's this shared process and kind of thought that helped ground you and like become more who you were, while also not having it be so so choose your own adventure, if you will. And there was this support and learning from communities. And in Orthodoxy, we don't separate the kids. The kids actually have a very kind of honored place where they go to the communion first. They're very included in the community, and I think that's something really beautiful. And we're losing it. Like, we don't have the place where after church you can sit and have a meal together. I mean, sometimes people do it on their own, but it's not part of the worship and the liturgy and the process. And so we're in community, but also living individually. And there's something about, like I was talking to my husband about like special needs kids, where there's sort of this pressure in culture when you hear someone has a kid who is autistic or Down syndrome or something. There's this sort of pity where it's like, oh no, I feel so sad for them. If there's this other part where I've always sort of been bothered by that, where it's like, but there's difficulty that comes with that, right? Yet there's also this weird blessing that comes with that too, where you learn something that you couldn't if you never had a kid. And Brody said something that I thought was really important, where it's like, if everybody's kid had incredible disabilities, it would be a really hard burden on society. Yet when you have one or two in a community, you share the blessings and you share the sort of the weight of that, and it becomes easier to hold. Yet we're missing that now when we have communities, but we're still seen as individuals, where a lot of families feel like they have to fight the battle of whatever it is to have a special needs kid on their own. And you're missing out on that shared blessing and like shared burden that comes with a good community. And that's where it's hard, where it's like, how do we integrate both the married and the single and the people struggling with identity and those who are more set in it, and have that better communion and community. It's not an easy question, but like, I think there is that kind of key that turns when you find that in a healthy place, and it opens the door up to a lot of these things that I don't think you would think of if you continue on the individualistic mindset that kind of fuels the American culture in a lot of ways.
Yep. Well, this is why I'm in Tucson. This is where I live, in the house that I live in, with the people that I am with. Why I accepted to be a pastor, even though I'd never sought it out, and it still feels really weird.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine anything more meaningful, better to do with my time than what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's all full circle, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, we think that we've solved the problem. What is it? Which Nordic country? We've solved the problem of Down syndrome. There are no Down syndrome kids being born because they're all aborted, right?
Yeah.
And we made that choice. And I say we, but I mean it's one of these countries like Sweden or something. And we could, in theory, make that choice given the technology that we have, but it's rebelling against what's given, right? It's like you said, you're given this burden. How much easier would it be for all of us if we just didn't have this burden? And so when we're presented with the world of choice, that's the kind of choice that we tend to make. And then we wonder why we're so confused and overwhelmed and anxious. And I think it goes back to that. I think we have an image of God. We have a purpose. We have things that we should be doing. We have a community, and we have to accept it rather than reject it. And that's the more ancient story that I think we need to recover some more of, and find a way to portray that.
Yeah.
in a good, right, valorizing way. Like coming to accept things that are given is I think a missing piece of storytelling.
I agree. I think I think it's really powerful in the way you lay it out. It makes, to me, it makes so much sense of the realities we're living in, like the confusion that we have in so much of society in all these different layers, whether it's like religiously, politically, gender, what have you. There's that it makes sense of that to me.
Right. So that's why I thought it was a really cool idea. I'll continue to be thinking about it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Any last
Right.
thoughts before we kind of wrap up the recording?
No. Well, if you're in Tucson, come.
Yeah, we'll have to.
Come find me.
Of course.
If you're in Tucson. Yeah.
No,
No, not just you, but I mean, like, to the audience.
Oh.
Like, if you're in Tucson, come find me. Right. Like, I live here.
Yeah. Well, can we put the link to the church in the? Okay, we'll put the link to the church, and so go find Michael. Join the community.
Right.
Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close the Serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.